We're in your American history book in chapter 20, America's Expanding Influence. We're going to be talking about the railroads, how the railroads span the nation, the settling in the West, the new outlying possessions, new relations with foreign nations, the Spanish-American War, and the advanced freedom and civilization in America. So this video is mainly going to be talking about the railroads. But here you see some pictures here of the railroads and the expanding west as settlers moved west onto, we're going to be going into advance in freedom and civilization onto the Spanish-American War, 1898 to 1899, a very quick war that you probably don't know too much about. And we're going to talk about these in the next few videos. So let's begin. American influence. Well, we talked about American influence in the age of industry, how businesses grew and prospered, and then on to the age of progress. And this was a progress in civilization and technology. Of course, the golden age of railroad, as the railroad spanned the nation, bringing more people to the west and more supplies back to the east. Also, it was called the Gilded Age, the political age of a lot of problems, as the gilded represented, of course, kind of a gold painted over gold, when underneath there was still, there was a lot of things, ugly things going on. So we talked about that already. And then, of course, how the gospel was spread throughout the nation and throughout the world during this time. So this is America's influence. You see from some of these pictures here, this is the time we called the Gilded Age, but we're going to be calling it, and now, you know, this age is going to be the age of progress. Railroads span the nation. The railroad was the most important means of transportation. And the Civil War Railroad was very important, of course, during the Civil War, especially in the North, to haul supplies. The Transcontinental Railroad was all the way to the Pacific, and it linked the East and the West. Congress approved 2 railroad companies. The railroad company, one went from Nebraska halfway and then all the way, the other went all the way to San Francisco. The first railroad was called the Union Pacific, and it laid tracks west from Omaha, Nebraska. And the next railroad was the Central Pacific, which started in Sacramento, California, and went eastward. And what they wanted these two railways to meet, so that we'd have a transcontinental railroad. You see some of the pictures in there here as they're building the railroad, and you see the trains and people looking, and as we'll see, they're going to have to build over a lot of mountain ranges and all kinds of, through miles and miles of desert, and this is what happened during this time. The project, the Transcontinental Project. In 1850, a railroad land grant was given, and it gave the right to lay track and the right for public land on each side of the track. On each side of the track, they would get 5 square miles, and it'd be like a checkerboard where the government would own part of that land and the railroad the other part of the land. The government also gave loans for $16,000, $32,000, and $48,000 for each mile of track, depending how rugged it was. If they're going through a mountain range, it would cost more than it would be just going through a prairie, right? So these loans were given for each mile of track. The Central Pacific began in 1863, and the Union Pacific began in 1865, these 2 railroads to meet. And they worked rapidly despite obstacles, almost like a race to see who could get there first, you know. So there was a major work, constant work going on the Transcontinental Railroad. Most important project at this time. The race to the finish. The Central Pacific had the materials shipped from the East Coast by sea. And the Union Pacific, the materials were shipped up the Missouri River or by wagon train. So you can see, especially Central Pacific, because the materials shipped sometimes had to go all the way around, South America to get by sea up to the West Coast. The Central Pacific hired 10,000 Chinese laborers. It was mainly the Chinese that worked on the Central Pacific, coming from the San Francisco, or I should say Sacramento area. So, and then the Union Pacific, they hired a lot of the veterans, the Civil War veterans, and a multitude of Irish immigrants that came from the East working on the railroad. So just think, the Irish came from the East, and here we have the Chinese coming from the West to meet there in Promontory Point. We'll be talking about that in a moment. But here's some pictures of the workers of the railroad. You can see the diversity there between the Chinese immigrants and the Irish immigrants. The driving final golden spike happened on May 10th, 1869 at Promontory Summit near Ogden, Utah. You can see the picture here, as you see on the map there, where Promontory Point was, and the green coming from Omaha, from the east, and you see from Sacramento. We see the red coming from Sacramento, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific coming from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific from Omaha. So they met there. They had prayer. There were 600 spectators, and the 4 ceremonial spikes that were silver sledge spikes were put in first, and then the final spike of gold was put in at Promontory Point. And basically they said and telegraphed, the telegraph units telegraphed, may God continue the unity of our country. The railroad unites 2 Western Union telegraphs celebrated at this point. May God continue the unity of our country. So basically that they telegraphed this across the country, and people all over cheered. We finally had a railroad that went clear across our country, the United States of America. And you can see some of these pictures here as they're coming together and driving that final spike at Promontory Point in Utah. Other transcontinental railroads started to form. There were actually 3 more that were completed in the mid-1880s, and you can see them on the map. The Northern Pacific went through the prairies, the Southern Pacific from New Orleans to Texas to the Gladstone Purchase all the way to California, as you see that bottom blue line there, Achican, Topeka, and Santa Fe, Kansas to the Southwest Desert all the way through in the midst, and on to basically these 3, the land grants were 18,000 land grants given at this time for these railroads. And the federal government would benefit from these land grants. So you can see here, as the railroads now were going across the nation, we still have those railroads. In fact, you can ride Amtrak all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast these days on these transcontinental railroads. Government benefits and problems. Okay, well, there was a first little market value for the land since the price increased drastically. So when they bought it, the market value of a lot of this land was pretty worthless. But when, of course, the trains bought it, this land later on would become quite expensive, being right next to the railroad, of course. So the railroads carried freight of the federal government, personal items, and also the mail. Those things were very important in going across country. So the federal government benefited from basically being able to put the mail, the federal mail, on the trains, and also using the trains for government work. And onto the Western rail lines reduced their fares for those buying railroad land. So what would happen now? Of course, this land that the railways owned and the government owned would now be for sale. And so they'd need to bring people to the West to look at this land and sell. They'd be selling more land, which they thought at one time was pretty worthless, but now would become the beginnings of cities and towns along the railways through America. So the railroad agent would greet the immigrants to buy the land, and they'd advertise this land even in Europe, bringing European into the land to buy American land along the transcontinental railways. But there was also the problem of a waste and corruption of the government. Because this wasn't private money, it was government money, it was wasted more than if it would belong to private companies. And of course, many repairs, and they even had to rebuild entire bridges as the government benefited, but the government also had to keep everything up in repair. Then came the private railroad lines. James J. Hill became one of the richest men in America at this time. He lived 1838 to 1916, and he built the fifth transcontinental railroad called the Great Northern. And the Great went through the areas of the Great Lakes to Seattle in 1893. And at this time, it was too late for the government funds, so he ended up basically buying it and putting it through as his private endeavor in a railroad line. So the private funds of James Hill, this private enterprise, became an empire business, which brought in much wealth for him. In fact, after the Depression, this was the only transcontinental railroad to really remain successful, was his railroad. But he plus bought other railroads along the way. Very wealthy entrepreneur. James J. Hill, railroad tycoon. The railroad networks. So here we have some pictures of the railroad networks. There was an increase in railroad mileage all throughout because small train lines would empty into the larger train lines. In 1870, the South had 2,500 more miles of railway than they did before the Civil War. So the South built a lot of railroads. In 1880, the greatest decade of growth in history of the railroad was basically an extra 70,300 miles of track. Can you imagine? So during this time, 70,300 is quite a lot of railroad track. In the 19th century, 200,000 miles of railroad track, more than all of Europe put together. So during the 19th century, you can look, was the great century of a multitude of railroads all over the United States. 250,000 miles peaked before World War I. So, before World War I started, in around 1914 or so, we had 250,000 miles of track. And this would include all of the integrated railroad systems that were small railroads that were combined with the larger railroads. And this would be used, these smaller lines on through wherever they were going to go would transport passengers, not only just cargo, but also passengers. And so it came to be that there would be a lot of more passenger trains to go across the country. And people that had never ever seen the West before would get on a train and be able to come to the West even as tourists. Railroad tycoons, two more railroad tycoons. Remember we had Hill basically buying his own railroad. Now we have two other that are known. Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he lived 1794 to 1877. You always think of Vanderbilt, I think of Gloria Vanderbilt and her jeans or whatever these days. But Cornelius Vanderbilt at that time was definitely buying up the railways. And he bought New York Central, New York to Albany to Buffalo. If you look more about Cornelius Vanderbilt, he started in the ferry business, just ferrying people across on ferries from New York, and then decided to get buying in the railway and became very, very wealthy. And he bought more railroads all the way to Chicago and to St. Louis. Just remember Cornelius Vanderbilt. There's a picture of him there. In 1877, 1877 is the year that he died. New York Central System was connecting to the Midwest. So his family would inherit the railroad business, become very wealthy. Jay Gould here was another railroad tycoon. He lived 1836 to 1892, and he controlled the railroads of the Southwest. So a few railroad tycoons getting very, very wealthy during this time and transporting goods and people across the country. You would have the major lines, which would be called the trunk lines, and they were the major lines with key points along the way. And then you'd have those feeder lines. These were the smaller lines that would feed into these bigger railroad lines. And now they were all trying to have standard track so that the trains could just go from one to the other. And it was becoming a way of travel, right? Even as it is even today. Improvements in the railroad safety and efficiency. Well, in 1886, I said this before, they had a standard gauge. The gauge is the distance between the rails. So the gauge would be how wide the rails are, or how the distance between them, how big they would span in that distance. And so now they wanted to standardize all this, make the rails a standard distance so they wouldn't have to worry about the trains, the size of the trains going on the tracks. And then in 1865, George M. Pullman, he lived 1831 to 1897, and he built a sleeping car and a dining car. These sleeping cars would go on so people could come, and not only would they be able to just sit and ride across the country, but they also could sleep like they were in their own bed at home. And then they could get up and dine, and they'd put food so they wouldn't have to, stop and go have multiple stops and go have dinner along the way. In 1869, George Westinghouse, who he lived 1846 to 1914, he built what was called the air brake. He became extremely wealthy with the air brakes because the air brakes had to apply to all the train that went across country. Because what the brakes would do is they'd hook up to the other cars, so when the engine would brake, then all the other cars would brake too, so the other cars would not crash into each other. That he would apply these brakes to the whole train, and that was really important to stop the train. So, of course, George Westinghouse, who later on invented a few other things, and he got involved with Tesla too. In the midst, became very wealthy. More powerful locomotives and heavier, longer trains needed those powerful locomotives. And stronger rails with better than iron, they'd make these rails of steel. And of course, that caused the steel industry to excel in every area because they had to build the steel for all of the railways you can imagine. So the steel industry became big business. And we heard about the steel industry with Andrew Carnegie, didn't we? As he invested into the steel industry and became very, very wealthy. Another wealthy tycoon. Western Union Telegraph also strung its wires along the railway all the way through, and basically gave the railroads the ability to telegraph, free telegraph, as they transplanted these rails and equipment to different stops along the railway. It became very important because the telegraph was the only way at that time to do communication in such a short term, in just a few minutes, actually. So they gave, like I said, free telegraph service to the railroads. And so the railroads and the telegraph system expanded together simultaneously. There's some pictures there. The telegraph and some of the tycoons there. George Pullman and Westinghouse down here at the bottom. The great age of a railroad. Well, this national growth would happen because the railroads were bringing people, that bought land. And so cities were growing. And also it created thousands of jobs and it generated millions of dollars. It stimulated other businesses along the way as they would purchase building materials. They needed building materials. And so other business would prosper along the railways. The steel industry, of course, was dependent on railroad growth. And it, like I said before, would grow. And of course, the towns with bringing in these materials along the way. There would be encouragement of trade in goods coming from Asia to America. So you think of Asia, well, they used to have to take a trip clear around South America. It would take 6 months to get their goods to America. But now they could take the steamer to San Francisco to the east and go east on the rail. So they could actually bring their goods from Asia to the West Coast, to San Francisco, usually through that area, and then get on the train, put their goods in the train, and bring them all the way to the East Coast. And they would make a lot more money than they had done before, going all the way around the tip of South America on a steamship, right? So it promoted a lot of growth and a lot of supplies coming in, merchandising coming in from China and Japan, from mainly China. Everyday life, of course, we had to have the concept of time because each city would go by a sundial to set their clocks, right? And this got kind of confusing when you had to get on a train at a certain time and you'd cross timelines. And so the concept of time was crucial for trains because they had to be on time. The trains could not, come in at the same time. Of course, there'd be a train collision. So anyway, they would have an official pocket watch to keep trains on time. On the train, everyone would have the official pocket watch, or the people that at least were running the train, I should say. Here's a picture of one. And not just every city could set their sun time, so they had to have a federal time convention to set, and they decided to set 4 time zones that we have today. The Eastern time zone, the Central time zone, the Mountain time zone, and the Pacific time zone. And as these were set, they could change their time as they passed the time zone, and the trains would be very accurately on time. So that's it for the railway, and we're going to go on to your next section. But as you can see, the Transcontinental Railroad was very important and brought a vast number of people interested in the West.